In just 47 seconds, legendary director Clint Eastwood would deliver the most brutal shutdown ever witnessed on The View, reducing Joy Behar to stammering silence before storming off the set in a blaze of fury. What started as a simple conversation about his latest film exploded into an all-out war when Behar decided to lecture the wrong man about Hollywood values. The cameras captured every devastating word of a meltdown that would leave the entire studio gasping. Before we dive into this explosive story, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, the confrontations the mainstream media won't show you, and the truth behind the celebrity masks. Hit that subscribe button now so you never miss another bombshell. Last night's episode of The View was supposed to be straightforward. Eastwood was there to discuss his new film, a gritty western that's been getting Oscar buzz. The legendary director, now in his 90s, walked onto that set with the same quiet confidence he's carried for decades. He shook hands with the panel, took his seat, and smiled politely as the audience applauded. Joy Behar opened with what seemed like a harmless question. She leaned forward, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, and asked Eastwood about his approach to storytelling in modern Hollywood. He answered thoughtfully, talking about how he believes in letting stories speak for themselves without heavy-handed messaging. He talked about respecting the audience's intelligence, about trusting viewers to draw their own conclusions. That's when Behar's expression changed. Her smile turned sharp. She interrupted him mid-sentence and said something that would set the entire confrontation in motion. She told him that his old-fashioned approach to filmmaking was part of the problem with Hollywood. She said that directors like him needed to use their platforms to push important messages, to educate audiences about social issues, to take a stand. Eastwood stopped talking. He just looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. The studio audience, sensing something brewing, went completely silent. Even the other panelists seemed to tense up, glancing at each other nervously. Then Eastwood spoke, his voice calm but cold as ice. He said he'd been making films for over 6 decades, and he'd never once felt the need to lecture his audience. He said he trusted people to think for themselves, something that seemed to be a dying concept in modern entertainment. He said he made movies for adults, not children who needed to be told what to think. Behar's face flushed red. She shot back that maybe that's why younger audiences weren't connecting with his films anymore. She said the world had changed, and if he couldn't adapt, maybe it was time to step aside and let a new generation of filmmakers take over. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, dripping with that smug certainty that she was on the right side of history. The other panelists tried to jump in, tried to smooth things over, but Eastwood held up his hand. He wasn't done. He looked directly at Behar and said something that would become the defining moment of the entire interview. He told her that in all his years in Hollywood, he'd met countless people who thought their opinions mattered more than everyone else's. People who thought they had the right to tell others how to think, how to live, what to believe. Behar tried to cut in, saying that wasn't fair, that she was just trying to have a dialogue. But Eastwood's expression made it clear he wasn't buying it. He said that a dialogue requires 2 people willing to listen to each other, and from where he was sitting, she'd already made up her mind before he'd even sat down. She wasn't interested in his perspective. She just wanted him to validate hers. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't the usual back and forth you see on talk shows where everyone's playing nice for the cameras. This was real tension, real conflict. And everyone in the studio could feel it crackling in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. One of the other panelists, clearly uncomfortable, tried to redirect the conversation to Eastwood's film. She asked about his casting choices, trying desperately to get things back on track. But Behar wasn't ready to let it go. She interrupted her colleague and said that actually she thought this was an important conversation to have. She said that artists with platforms have responsibilities, whether they want to acknowledge them or not. Eastwood's jaw tightened. You could see him making a decision in that moment, weighing whether to let it slide or to push back harder. He chose to push back. He said that the only responsibility an artist has is to their craft and their audience, not to politicians, not to activists, and certainly not to talk show hosts who think they speak for everyone. He said that art used to be about exploring the human condition, about asking questions rather than providing answers. Now it had become propaganda, pure and simple. And anyone who dared to create something that didn't fit the approved narrative got attacked, dismissed, or cancelled. He said he'd rather retire than become a puppet for someone else's agenda. Behar's face was getting redder by the second. She said that nobody was asking him to be a puppet. They were asking him to evolve, to recognize that the world had changed and that stories needed to change with it. She said that young people today demanded authenticity and activism from their heroes, and if he couldn't provide that, maybe he wasn't the hero they needed anymore. The insult hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Eastwood sat perfectly still for a moment, his eyes never leaving Behar's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the audio engineers had to scramble to boost the levels. He said that he'd never claimed to be anyone's hero. That wasn't his job. His job was to tell stories that resonated with people, stories that reflected real life in all its complexity and contradiction. He said that young people were a lot smarter than Behar gave them credit for. They could think for themselves. They didn't need every movie to come with a lecture about how to be a good person. They could watch a story unfold and draw their own conclusions. But Hollywood had lost faith in audiences, and that was the real tragedy. Not that he wouldn't preach, but that so many others felt they had to. Another panelist tried again to intervene, suggesting that maybe they could agree to disagree and move on to lighter topics. But Behar shook her head. She said no, this was important. She turned back to Eastwood and said that she'd watched a lot of his films over the years, and she'd noticed a pattern. Strong male protagonists solving problems with violence. Women as props or prizes, simplistic views of good and evil. She said that maybe, just maybe, those kinds of stories had contributed to some of the problems society was dealing with now. Maybe his films had reinforced toxic masculinity, had taught boys that violence was the answer, had reduced women to supporting characters in men's stories. She said it was worth thinking about, wasn't it? The impact his work had had on culture. That was the final straw. Eastwood's entire demeanor changed. The polite guest disappeared, replaced by something harder, colder. He said that he'd heard this same tired criticism for 50 years, from people who'd never created anything themselves but felt qualified to tear down those who had. He said his characters weren't simple, they were complex human beings dealing with impossible situations. He said that reducing his entire filmography to toxic masculinity showed a fundamental misunderstanding of both his work and the human experience. His films explored violence, they didn't celebrate it. They showed the cost of conflict, the weight of difficult choices, the complexity of morality in an imperfect world. But apparently, that nuance was lost on people who only saw what they wanted to see. As for women in his films, he pointed out that he'd directed some of the strongest female characters in cinema. He'd given actresses roles that showcased their talent and complexity. But he'd never felt the need to apologize for also telling stories about men. Because last he checked, men were still half the population, and their stories still mattered too. Behar tried to interrupt, but Eastwood kept talking, his voice rising slightly for the first time. He said that this was exactly the problem with modern discourse. Everything had to be analyzed through a political lens. Every character had to check certain boxes. Every story had to deliver the approved message. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for complexity, no tolerance for different perspectives. He said he'd spent his whole life fighting against that kind of narrow-minded thinking. In the 1950s and 60s, he'd fought against studio bosses who wanted to control every aspect of his career. In the 70s and 80s, he'd fought against critics who said westerns were dead and he was a relic. Now, in what might be his final years, he was fighting against people like Behar, who wanted to police art and turn entertainment into indoctrination. The studio had gone from dead silent to buzzing with nervous energy. Producers were frantically signaling to the director in the control booth. Camera operators were zooming in tight on both faces, capturing every micro-expression. This had stopped being an interview and had become something else entirely. A moment of truth that nobody had seen coming. He said he'd always walked away from those people because life was too short to waste time with folks who couldn't respect different viewpoints. Then he paused, let the words hang in the air, and added that he was looking at one of those people right now. The audience gasped. Behar's mouth literally fell open. You could see her struggling to process what had just happened, trying to formulate a response. But Eastwood wasn't giving her the chance. He continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire studio with its intensity. He talked about how Hollywood used to be a place where different ideas could coexist, where artists with opposing viewpoints could still respect each other's work. He said somewhere along the way that had been lost. Now it was all about conformity, about pushing the approved narrative, about shutting down anyone who dared to think differently. He said it had become a place of bullies and cowards, and he'd had enough of it. Behar finally found her voice. She tried to interrupt, saying that he was being dramatic, that she was just asking questions. But Eastwood cut her off. He told her that she wasn't asking questions at all. She was making judgments. She was trying to put him in a box, trying to shame him for not falling in line with her worldview. He said he'd spent 90+ years not falling in line with anyone, and he sure as hell wasn't going to start now. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of what was rapidly becoming the most uncomfortable television moment in recent memory. The other panelists sat frozen, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let it play out. Behar, her voice shaking slightly now, tried a different approach. She said she had the utmost respect for his career, but that times had changed. She said audiences expected more from their entertainers now. They expected them to be activists, to use their influence for good. She practically spat the words, as if daring him to disagree with the concept of doing good. Eastwood's response was devastating in its simplicity. He said that he didn't need Joy Behar or anyone else to define what good meant for him. He said he'd done more for his community, for veterans, for young filmmakers than most people in that building would do in 10 lifetimes. But he didn't do it for applause or virtue points. He did it because it mattered to him, not because someone told him he should. Then he said something that would become the most quoted line from the entire confrontation. He looked at Behar and said that the difference between them was simple. She wanted to tell people how to think. He trusted them to think for themselves. She wanted control. He wanted freedom. And that fundamental difference meant they'd never see eye to eye on anything. Behar's composure completely cracked. She raised her voice, something she rarely does on camera, and said that she was sick of men like him acting like they were above it all. She said his generation had screwed up the world, and now they wanted to lecture younger people about respect and freedom. Her voice was getting louder with each word, angrier, more desperate. She told him that maybe if he'd spent less time making movies about tough guys with guns and more time actually listening to people who disagreed with him, he'd understand why the world had moved on without him. She said his films were relics of a bygone era, and so was he. The personal attack was stunning in its cruelty, especially directed at a man in his 90s. The audience's collective intake of breath was audible. Even the camera operators seemed shocked. One of the other panelists, her face pale, tried to intervene, suggesting they take a commercial break. But it was too late. The damage was done, and Eastwood wasn't going to let it slide. Eastwood stood up slowly, deliberately. He looked down at Behar, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but somehow more powerful than if he'd been shouting. He told her that she'd just proven every point he'd been making. She couldn't handle someone disagreeing with her, so she resorted to personal attacks. She couldn't argue on the merits, so she tried to tear him down. He said that in his 90+ years, he'd faced down studio executives, critics, and even presidents, and none of them had been able to shake him. A talk show host with an inflated sense of importance sure as hell wasn't going to do it either. The insult was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it hit even harder. Behar tried to respond, stammering something about how she didn't mean it that way, how he was twisting her words. But Eastwood wasn't listening anymore. He unclipped his microphone, the gesture deliberate and final. He told the producers he was done, that he wouldn't waste another second in a place that clearly had no interest in actual conversation, only in pushing an agenda. Before he stood up, though, he delivered one final blow that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. He looked around at all the panelists, not just Behar, and said that the saddest part of the whole exchange wasn't that they disagreed. He disagreed with people his whole life and remained friends with many of them. The sad part was that they couldn't even have a disagreement anymore without it devolving into personal attacks and moral grandstanding. He said that when he was younger, you could have heated debates with people and still respect them when it was over. You could argue about politics, art, philosophy, whatever. And at the end of the day, you'd shake hands and maybe grab a drink together. But somewhere along the line, that had been lost. Now, if you disagreed with someone, they didn't just think you were wrong, they thought you were evil, or stupid, or some kind of threat that needed to be eliminated. He said that kind of thinking was poison. It was destroying not just Hollywood but the entire country. And shows like this one were feeding that poison directly into millions of homes every single day. They were teaching people that anyone who thought differently was an enemy, that nuance was weakness, that certainty was strength, even when you were dead wrong. The words landed like hammer blows. Every single person in that studio knew he was right, even if they'd never admit it. You could see it in their faces, the recognition that they'd become exactly what he was describing. They'd created an echo chamber where only certain opinions were acceptable, where disagreement was treated as betrayal, where independence of thought was seen as dangerous. Behar, to her credit, tried one last time to salvage something from the wreckage. She said that she appreciated his passion and his perspective, even if she didn't agree with it. She said that healthy debate was important, and she was glad they could have this discussion. Her voice was shaking slightly, betraying how rattled she actually was, but she was trying to end things on a civilized note. But Eastwood wasn't interested in a polite exit. He told her that this hadn't been a healthy debate. A healthy debate required good faith on both sides, and she'd made it clear from the start that she wasn't operating in good faith. She'd come into this with her mind made up, ready to put him in a box and dismiss everything he'd accomplished because it didn't fit her narrow worldview. That wasn't debate, that was theater. And he was done performing. As he started to walk off the set, Behar called after him, her voice now desperate rather than angry. She said they still had 10 minutes left in the segment. She said he'd agreed to be there. She was trying to regain some semblance of control, but it was painfully obvious that she'd lost it completely. Eastwood stopped and turned back one last time. He said that he'd agreed to come on the show to talk about his film, not to be lectured by someone who'd never created anything close to what he had in his entire career. He said that if this was what passes for intelligent discourse these days, then Hollywood really was in worse shape than he'd thought. Then he looked directly at the camera and said something that would become instant viral gold. He told the audience at home that they should never let anyone tell them how to think, not celebrities, not politicians, and certainly not daytime talk show hosts who'd forgotten what it meant to have a real conversation with someone they disagreed with. He said independent thought was the most valuable thing a person could have, and they should guard it fiercely against people who wanted to take it away. With that, he walked off the set. The cameras followed him as he strode through the backstage area, past stunned crew members, and out the exit. Behind him, on set, complete chaos had erupted. Behar was yelling at the producers. The other panelists were trying to figure out how to salvage the segment. The audience was buzzing with shocked conversation. But none of it mattered, because the moment was already over. In less than 15 minutes, what should have been a friendly promotional interview had exploded into one of the most dramatic confrontations in talk show history. And it all happened because Joy Behar made the fatal mistake of thinking she could lecture Clint Eastwood about how the world works. The show cut to a commercial break, but the damage was irreversible. When they came back, Behar tried to play it off, making jokes about how some people couldn't handle tough questions, but her hands were shaking as she shuffled her papers. Her voice lacked its usual confidence. She knew, just like everyone watching knew, that she'd been completely dismantled by someone who'd forgotten more about life and art than she'd ever know. The other panelists tried to move on to the next topic, but the energy in the studio had fundamentally shifted. They'd all witnessed something that rarely happens on live television: a complete and total loss of control. A moment where the usual scripts and talking points fell apart and revealed the raw truth underneath. What made it even more striking was the contrast between the two figures at the center of the storm. Eastwood, the 90-something legend who'd seen and done everything, walking away with his dignity intact and his point made. Behar, the talk show host who'd overplayed her hand, left sitting there trying to pretend she hadn't just been put in her place by someone who'd earned the right to speak his mind through decades of actual achievement. The whole thing was a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview. If Behar had approached Eastwood with genuine curiosity instead of condescension, if she'd asked questions instead of making pronouncements, if she'd shown even a shred of respect for his experience and accomplishments, none of this would have happened. But she couldn't help herself. She had to try to score points, had to try to put him in his place, had to try to prove that she was smarter and more enlightened than this old-fashioned dinosaur sitting across from her. Instead, she got destroyed. Not with shouting or theatrics, but with calm, measured words from someone who'd lived long enough to see through every trick in the book. Eastwood didn't need to raise his voice or resort to cheap shots. He just spoke the truth as he saw it, refused to back down from his principles, and walked away when it became clear that the conversation had devolved into something beneath him. The final moments of this segment showed Behar forcing a smile, trying to crack jokes to lighten the mood. But it was too late. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone had watched her lose control, watched her resort to personal attacks when her arguments failed, watched her get called out for exactly what she was doing. The mask had slipped, and there was no putting it back on. As the show finally moved to its next segment, you could still see the tension in Behar's shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. She'd been in the game long enough to know what had just happened. She'd picked a fight with the wrong person, someone who had the moral authority and life experience to completely shut her down. And he'd done it without breaking a sweat. The confrontation lasted less than 20 minutes from start to finish, but it would be talked about for years. It became an instant case study in what happens when someone mistakes a platform for wisdom, when they confuse talking the loudest with being right, when they assume that their opinion matters more than actual experience and accomplishment. Eastwood had spent his entire career letting his work speak for itself. He'd directed masterpieces, acted in classics, built a legacy that would outlast all of them. He didn't need to argue with Joy Behar. He didn't need to prove anything to her or to anyone else. But when pushed, when disrespected, when treated like his decades of experience meant nothing, he showed exactly why he'd become a legend in the first place. He stood his ground. He spoke his truth. And then he walked away, leaving behind a talk show host who'd just learned a very expensive lesson about the difference between having a microphone and having something worth saying. The cameras kept rolling as Eastwood disappeared through the exit, his back straight, his head high, a man who knew exactly who he was and didn't need anyone's approval to validate it. That image, of Clint Eastwood walking off the View set after reducing Joy Behar to stammering justifications, would become the defining moment of last night's show. It was raw, it was real, and it was absolutely devastating. And for once, the person doing the preaching learned what it felt like to be on the receiving end of some hard truth.